Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka lead a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, once again, we've got Dr. Stephen Nagy. You already know him, but just let me introduce him briefly. He is a Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo. And this is our second session about geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. During the past 2 weeks, since after first session, there have been a lot of news about the region in not only in Japan but also in the global press. And I believe that Stephen will be talking about some of these happenings tonight too. So as Stephen said in the beginning, he's going to introduce the topic and let us know what has been happening here about with the partners of Japan and alliances. And after that, we'll open the room for discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand and let us know so that we can bring you up on stage and we can talk about the topic. Well, Stephen, let's start.
All right, Maya, thank you very much for, again, organizing this session on geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role. And thank you very much to all of our friends on the call today. So I really encourage you to jump in at any time to ask questions and to share your views or to raise questions or points. I know that Jed is here from the Korea Now podcast. So if he has any comments, jump in. That's a great podcast that I encourage you all to listen to. I see Ren online, Han, Fong, Lan Lan, and many others. So do jump in and share your ideas about the Indo-Pacific. So this week's theme is looking at what I call instruments in the Indo-Pacific. So thinking about the different ways that we're seeing an institutionalization process going on. And I want to break it down into, I guess, maybe 6 quick areas. The first one and the most recent one is the AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US Defense Pact that was just signed earlier this week. And I think there'll be a lot of questions on that. Second, I'd like to talk a little bit about the U.S. alliance network, but also strategic partnerships that Japan and others are forming within the region. Third, touch upon the Quad a little bit and how the Quad is evolving. And I think this is timely because this week we're going to see a Quad meeting with Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Suga, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison. I do remember his name. It's not the fellow from Down Under, but Scott Morrison will be meeting with President Biden in the White House. And I think they'll discuss some important cooperation moving forward. And it's not just going to be about security cooperation. I think that's really key. I want to touch a little bit upon infrastructure connectivity, trade, and lastly, resilient supply chain initiatives. And I think that's something really critical for you to be thinking about. And I think why those initiatives are really important is that because I think that they provide opportunities for countries that are uncomfortable with security cooperation in the region because of the relationship with China to provide some public goods. So here I'm thinking about South Korea, perhaps Vietnam, as well as European countries and even New Zealand. So I think that these initiatives are really important. So to help you better understand, I think this kind of, I guess, these instruments within the region that are helping institutionalize things, I think if we start off at the AUKUS Defense Pact that was just discussed this week, it's really useful. We see the UK, Australia, and the United States agreeing to exchange and develop the most sophisticated of technologies, and that's these nuclear submarines. And Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, has been very explicit that these are nuclear-powered submarines, not submarines that can launch nuclear missiles. And I think that distinction is really important because Australia is a key partner, just like Japan is, in promoting the denuclearization of the region and of the world. So I think that's really important. And you might be saying, why is AUKUS at the top of this kind of institutionalization process within the region or instruments in the region? And I think simply, these are the countries that are most forward-leading in terms of their security posture within the region. They have close cooperation. They work together in terms of the Five Eyes, so that's New Zealand, Canada, Australia, the UK, and the United States, in terms of intelligence sharing. And of course, they're extremely trusted partners in terms of their historical relationships, in terms of their military cooperation, and broadly, I think, their diplomatic approach. Also, and I think importantly, that they have a shared view about the challenges of the Indo-Pacific moving forward as China tries to expand its diplomatic and economic influence within the region. So AUKUS represents, I guess, the security layer of institutionalization or instruments within the region. And we see that this is a defense pact, not necessarily an alliance, and they will be developing these very, very, I think, important technologies, nuclear-run submarines. And why nuclear as opposed to the French subs or other subs? Well, simply they can stay underwater longer, quieter, and create a really important defense and deterrence mechanism in the first and second island chain. So the first island chain is Philippines, Taiwan, through the Okinawa Islands, up through Honshu, up to Hokkaido and the Sakhalins. And this is really important in terms of ensuring that a more assertive or a more forward-leaning China doesn't perhaps try to take over the Senkaku Islands or Taiwan by force. So that's really important. The second island chain, that's Guam, Hawaii. This is often seen as kind of the boundary line of the United States' influence within the region. So AUKUS is really security focused. It's the latest technologies, and I think that it's really important for us to understand that this is a security partnership of the most forward-leading countries. The second layer that I mentioned was the U.S. alliance system and security partnerships in general. And we know the U.S. alliance system is connecting, of course, Japan, U.S., South Korea. There's alliance with the Philippines, and we won't call them formal alliances with Singapore and Thailand, but really long-standing cooperation in the military level in terms of joint training, some technological sharing, and joint exercises, such as the COBRA exercises that we've seen. So the U.S. alliance system is a really important part of the broader instruments within the region to try and shape the region so that it evolves around a rules-based structure, in particular in the maritime domain. So I think that's a really important area. Now, I also mentioned strategic partners, and I think if everybody remembers, back in October last year, Scott Morrison came to Tokyo, and he spent one day with Prime Minister Suga, and he signed a commitment to a defense treaty with reciprocal basing rights between the two countries. And I think that was a really, really big commitment. Japan was expanding its partnerships within the region. Australia is expanding its partnership with Japan. It's a sign of trust with reciprocal basing rights. And it's a sign that these countries are viewing some of the challenges within the region, whether it's North Korea or China, as requiring or necessitating cooperation. And I think that equation hasn't changed in the past past 6 months or year. Actually, I think that it's deepened in light of some of the changes on the maritime front and the terrestrial front that we've seen. So I think AUKUS and the U.S. alliance system really represent those security forms of instruments within the region to try and ensure the region develops along a peaceful and stable and secure area. Many of us are thinking about what is the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. That's the cooperation between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And I think most of us understand the Quad's history, but after the Aceh earthquake in 2005, these four countries came together to provide humanitarian and disaster relief to the people of the Indian Ocean, and in particular Aceh. And this was seen as a potential platform for broader cooperation. It evolved, and then it kind of fell apart as the Australians were worried about how the Quad would be perceived by China, and there was some mistrust with the Indians and Australians. But as Prime Minister Abe came back into power in December 2012, what we saw is that he eventually resurrected the idea of the quadrilateral security dialogue. And it remained kind of a problematic dialogue in that the four partners within the Quad had different views of what the Quad should be doing, what kinds of activities they should be involved in, and the scope of its activities. But China helped a lot in terms of consolidating, I think, a focus on what the Quad should be doing. And I think the shift in administration from the Trump administration to the Biden administration really thought about what's the best way to get buy-in from regional stakeholders, so Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, even Korea, Taiwan, and extra-regional partners such as Canada, the European countries, and New Zealand. For many of them, they don't want to choose between their trading partner and their security partner and comprehensive partner. So they felt much more comfortable with the Quad evolving to provide what we call public goods in the region. And we saw that in March 2021 with the virtual Quad Summit, that there was a big shift away from purely maritime security cooperation to talking about vaccine development and distribution to emerging countries, to selective technology cooperation, to focusing on what we call selective diversification of supply chains. So the Quad has really kind of evolved into what I call an instrument that provides public goods to the region. And if it continues down that line, and I think it will, and this week I think the announcement of the Quad in Washington will focus on supply chains in particular and cooperation in semiconductor supply chains, that this will be a really important way to be thinking about how the Quad is used to bring the region together and provide public goods. This leads to, I guess, the fourth area that I want to touch upon, and that's that infrastructure and connectivity. So building bridges and roads and ports for the region, and I'm thinking in particular about Southeast Asia and South Asia, so that they could be more dynamic economically, so that they're more connected in their regions, so they can function more autonomously. So today, Southeast Asian countries really they trade more with China than they do with themselves. And this is a problem. It creates an asymmetry of trade relations with China. And with that, it creates challenges in terms of how independent they can be in terms of their choices. And Han on the call in Vietnam, and I just wrote a paper about this. And if you're interested, I encourage her to jump in and share some of her thoughts. But I think that Japan, in particular, is interested in strengthening the strategic autonomy of Southeast Asian countries in South Asia by helping them build their economies so they can do more trade with each other. And more trade with each other means they can start to make more independent decisions of how to deal with South China Sea issues, East China Sea issues, and broader challenges within the region. So infrastructure connectivity is a big area, and it's not just limited to Japan, Australia, India cooperating. What we see is Japan has reached out to the European Union, and they have something called the Asia Infrastructure and Connectivity Initiative. That's an important initiative to try and provide infrastructure to the region. We have India and Japan working together in the Asian Africa Growth Corridor. We've had the United States, Australia, and Japan create a funding organization that funds infrastructure and connectivity. So what's clear is that another instrument to help build the Indo-Pacific region is creating more integration by building infrastructure and connectivity. And that's going to continue. And of course, that is meant to compete with the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, but also provide some independent um, infrastructure connectivity to the region. The fifth area that I mentioned was trade, and this region is filled with trading countries. Trading countries in terms of high value trade agreements like the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership. And here we see some Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, and Malaysia being very forward thinking about how they can open up their markets, develop intellectual property rights, help develop and protect their environment and labor, and connect themselves to rich, advanced countries. And for them, agreements like the TPP-11 is an important instrument to help develop their countries, but also help the region integrate and build shared standards in terms of labor law, environmental law, protection of intellectual property rights. Another instrument that is with trade, of course, is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's called RCEP. And RCEP is also important. And what's interesting about RCEP is, China's included, South Korea's included, Japan's included, all the Southeast Asian countries are included, New Zealand, and Australia. And what this shows is that these countries, despite some of their geopolitical challenges with China, still want to do trade with China. They believe that embedding China in free trade agreements is a way to moderate its behavior and create shared interest. And I think that's a really important instrument moving forward. How can we bind China in different kinds of regional initiatives so that it develops shared ideas and norms about trade, about transparency, about the environment. And we'll probably come back to this. The last point I wanted to mention in kind of my opening comments before I open up the floor is an initiative that's related to resilient supply chain initiatives. Now, you might be saying, what is resilient supply chain initiatives? So I think a good way to think about it is thinking about not putting all your eggs in one basket. So I think over the past 10 years, we've had a few critical junctures in how we think about our relationship with China in terms of our economic relationships and in terms of the over-concentration of supply chains in China. We saw back in 2010 when there was an incident between Chinese fishermen and the Japanese Coast Guard that and the Chinese fisherman was arrested under Okinawa law, that the response of the Chinese government was to temporarily halt and limit the supply of rare earth materials to Japanese businesses. And of course, our phones, our cars, many of the key industries that, the leading industries in Japan use these kinds of rare earth materials to build their most sophisticated technologies. So what we saw is, and I think Japan learned this very well, that they needed to diversify where they get rare earth materials from so that they're not susceptible to rare earth embargo. After the 2012 nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, here again we saw many Japanese businesses not leave China, but they started to change their model in China. They started to build things in China for the Chinese, by Chinese, with Japanese technologies. And they started to think about other platforms in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And we've seen a slow movement of developing new alternative supply chains in those two regions. They can't replace China. China's too big. There's too many consumers there. And I think it's too valuable as a consumer market, but also in terms of a cheap, very sophisticated center of logistics. Making it, at this particular stage, something that nobody can afford to be not part of. The pandemic showed us something very different. With the COVID-19 emerging out of Wuhan, and Wuhan is a center of car manufacturing, so Honda, Toyota, and many other car manufacturers had big manufacturing industries there. And the black swan event of COVID-19 basically shut down those car manufacturing centers for several months. And the COVID-19 pandemic basically demonstrated that there's too much of an over-concentration of supply chains in certain parts of China and in China in general. And as a result, there was a need to diversify some of those supply chains within China and throughout the region to prevent the kind of weaponization of supply chains, but also to protect businesses and the global community from another black swan event that could disrupt supply chains. So I think that's really important. That's something that we need to distinguish in the context of this selective diversification of supply chains. And what we saw back in April, May 2020 is the Ministry of Finance in Japan put forward a budget to help some Japanese businesses reshore to Japan and to start to build what they call resilient supply chains in Southeast Asia and South Asia. That wasn't, again, it wasn't meant to replace China, but to build some insurance, supply chain insurances, such that if another black swan event happened in China, that it would not have such negative pressure on Japanese businesses. So resilient supply chain initiatives has really become an important topic for many countries, and it's an area of cooperation that we're going to see more cooperation moving forward. The Quad discussions this week are going to talk about it. Just last week, the European Union released an Indo-Pacific strategy report, and they talked about resilient supply chains and trying to improve the resilience of supply chains through the region. And they are focusing not only on low-value products, but more and more there's concerns about high-value, high-tech products, in particular semiconductors. So this week, there's going to be a lot of discussions in Washington about how to ensure there's a steady supply of the high-tech semiconductors that are made in Taiwan from the Taiwanese manufacturing semiconductor manufacturer, and how countries like Japan and the United States, India and Australia can find alternatives to ensure that there's a steady supply of those semiconductors that go in our phones, that go in fighter jets, that go in our cars. So these, in a nutshell, I guess, are the 6 kind of instruments that we can think about when we're thinking about how the region is building institutions and a layered approach to building security, building I guess, military security, economic security, supply chain security, and helping the region develop institutions that are sustainable, that are transparent, and that are rules-based. So that's a few ideas to start the discussion. Again, I encourage anybody just to raise their hand or step in and raise questions or bring in your point of view, and we'll go from there.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. We've got already Ren and Umesh. Just before we go forward, I have a question to you. So back to your point of infrastructure and connectivity. So it is clear that through investing into the development of the infrastructure of East and South Asian countries, so Japan is actually working to create that trust, to strengthen it, not only between Japan and those countries it invests in, but also between the countries themselves. But I have also noticed that China has been investing in such infrastructural projects too. So do you think that this is an open rivalry, a kind of open rivalry? Because obviously there is a rivalry in terms of military power, if I can say this, and I think that I'm not mistaken, but also economic power, and then investment as well. Just I wonder.
So Maya, that's
whether,
a great.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's a great point. So, historically, Japan after World War II, it wasn't able to use its military in the same way. It doesn't have a military officially; it has a self-defense force. So it really had to develop what we call developmental diplomacy. So it used tools like ODA, Overseas Development
Right.
Assistance, and FDI, for
Okay.
foreign direct investment. And they really invested heavily in Southeast Asia for more than 40 years. And that investment of building bridges and ports and building manufacturing centers was really valued by Southeast Asian countries. And we talk to Southeast Asian countries, who's the most trusted partners in Southeast Asia? It's Japan, followed by the EU. Now, Japan has also joined and provided some assistance to India as well. And today, India is the biggest recipient of Japanese FDI and ODA. And we've seen things like the Mumbai-Calcutta corridor being built, manufacturing districts being built northeast of Delhi. So Japan is very interested in cultivating both of these markets and building strong, enduring ties. And it's part of a broader economic strategy of building the production networks close to the future consumption markets. Now, you're correct. China has come on to provide aid. So has Korea. And China does it through the BRI. And the BRI has become a real platform for building infrastructure and creating China's soft power in many countries. But I think that the gold standard still is the Japanese standard. But I must say it's the slow standard. It's a less ambitious standard because Japan's has very stringent transparency rules, fiscal rules, environmental rules that make it a little, slower and more difficult for emerging countries to deal with. And I remember my last trip to Nepal, my host pointed to a road over there by Japan, and it was a small, 2-lane road, and they said, well, that took the Japanese 3 years to make. And then they showed me this big road that had like 3 or 4 lanes, and they said, that's the Chinese road that they made in 3 months. There's a difference in scale today, but I think that when we were to compare them side by side, you would see that Japan has a much longer history in providing untied infrastructure connectivity projects to Southeast Asia and more to South Asia. And China is now, they have selective areas where I think they provide a huge amount of aid, like Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But if the China model is not necessarily seen as, I guess, the gold standard in terms of infrastructure connectivity and, building strong relations through these kind of developmental diplomacy.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay, so
You're welcome.
yeah, thank you. So Ren, hello.
Yes, hi. Hi, Stephen. Maya, how are you?
Hey, Ren.
Hey. I have a quick question for Stephen, I guess.
Sure.
The Quad, if you look at the GDP, US is number 1, India is number 5, Japan is number 3, and Australia is number 14. But there's a country that is ranked number 10, that is Canada. And also, if you look at the military expenditure, the Australia is number 11 in terms of the amount of money they spent, and Canada is number 13, which is actually ahead of Israel, which is number 14. So I have to say, Canada is notably missing from this Quad. Is there a reason why Canada is not becoming a quintet or quartet? A quintet, I guess. Quint instead of Quad. Any reason? If you can shed some light, we appreciate it.
Thanks, Ren. So I don't speak on behalf of the Canadian government, but I think at this particular stage, we're having an election right now in Canada. I know everybody should be watching the Canadian election tonight, but once the results of the Canadian election are complete, I think that there'll be some movement on the Quad. But the Quad it's a Quad. It's 4 countries. And I think what we've seen is a growing tendency towards what we call Quad plus cooperation. So back in January 2021, Canada joined the 4 Quad countries in joint training in and around Guam in terms of maritime domain awareness activities. We saw the Quad countries in April join the French in the Perouse exercises. Again, this was seen as the French exercises plus the Quad. And growingly, I think what we're seeing is not so much countries joining the Quad per se, but they're finding what we call functional opportunities to cooperate in Quad activities. And it's not necessarily just maritime domain awareness activities. It could be infrastructure connectivity. So if you look at the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, they're interested in participating in the Quad in infrastructure connectivity. I think in terms of vaccine development and distribution, I think many European countries would like to work with the Quad in that capacity as well. So I think that it's maybe unhelpful to think about the expansion of the Quad in terms of membership. I think it's more helpful to think about how the Quad you can add, like a Lego block, right? Add a block, take away a block, and it turns into something else. And I think that's the direction of how the Quad's going to evolve moving forward, rather than thinking about, an expansion of alliances. And in my opening remarks, you probably noticed I started with AUKUS and then the U.S. alliance system and then the Quad. And the first two are very security related. And the Quad is squeezed between a security relationship and those public goods. And I think that the four Quad members are very conscious that if they are thinking purely in terms of security, that they won't be able to function amongst themselves well. I don't think our Indian friends really want to have a very open security based cooperative organization, although they've tilted a little bit more that direction. Our Japanese friends have limitations. Australia is small compared to the United States and China. So the security cooperation part is really, I think, increasingly difficult to be thinking about. So Canada, going back to the root of your question, I think it's going to look at the Quad in terms of what areas can it add some value, and where can it jump in and jump out. And I think that's the direction it's going to move forward.
Yeah, thanks. The only point I may make is unlike those European countries, Canada is really in the circle of the Pacific Rim. So I would think they would be more interested in this than the European nations. But, we'll see what happens tonight, I guess.
Well, my view is they're still having to deal with, two Canadians that are in Chinese prisons, being held through hostage diplomacy, and that's something that they have to thread the needle. I think that they need to think about what's the direction of the country under new leadership. And frankly, I think that under the previous administration in the United States, they were concerned about what kind of U.S. commitment would be to the region, and would it be more focused on economic and diplomatic and infrastructure engagement, or would it be kind of a hard security approach? And for smaller countries, we definitely have to think twice and three and four times about how we cooperate with the United States if it's if it focuses only on security, because I think there's everybody has clear recognition that China will try to split us, and we're the weaker member of that partnership, and we'll be the target.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ran.
Okay, and I think that next we've got Ravi. So I'm afraid that I lost, the order. I'm not sure whether I can keep the order of accession actually. So if I'm mistaken, please
I think I saw Ravi, Umesh, and Mark.
Yes,
and then
I think that
Sumit,
was
Han, and Veer.
Okay, thank you for that, Stephen. So please help me later again. So Ravi, hello.
Sure.
Yes. Okay.
Well, good evening, Dr. Stephen, and good evening, Maya. Thank you again. Very interesting and kind of comprehensive information which you have shared. I have a couple of questions. Probably, okay, I will jump in and throw up questions as the discussion moves on. So my first question would be with regards to AUKUS. Yes, France is actually a loser in this strategic defense deal, which US, Australia, and UK have gone with it. And France was the only country, or I should say, the European country, who has a very strong presence in the Pacific region, and also, and it has its own, the defense. The soldiers are also placed here, France has been playing a pretty important role in the Indo-Pacific. Uh, the development and the relationship, and making the region much more stable. Now, with this AUKUS happening and France losing out, do you see France would be kind of like reevaluating its strategy in this Indo-Pacific region?
Okay, Ravi, I think that's a great question. And I want to just give you some background. Do you remember Australian friends? They were negotiating with both France and Japan at the same time. And the French beat the Japanese in terms of securing the contract with the Japanese. So I think what's clear is that the defense industry is cutthroat. I think behind the scenes, the French understand that it's very cutthroat. They were cutthroat when they were out competing the Japanese to get the contract with the Australians. And, the French were probably very upset about losing the contract, but I think they understand the nature of the defense industry. The withdrawal of the French ambassadors in both Canberra and Washington, I think that's the French had to do this. They had to show their anger, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the interest-based relationship of the French with the United States and the French with the Australians within the region. And if you listen to French former and current diplomats, when they're talking about what's happened this week, they've said very explicitly the Australians are their closest partner within the region. Australia, is next door to whether it's Noumea or Caledonia or other French territories within the region, and they must have a working relationship with Australia to maximize and secure those interests. So I think that, yes, the French are upset, but will it fundamentally change their interests within the region? And here, I don't think that it will fundamentally change their interests within the region.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Pretty interesting. Because
call me Stephen. Call me Stephen, Ravi. All right.
Well, okay, Stephen. Yes, and the another point is, see, this discussion or this strategic alliance or the defense agreement, didn't happen overnight. I'm sure French would be kind of aware of these discussions happening between these countries. So, of course, you as a sovereign nation, you always like to, protect your business. And losing out 12 diesel-powered submarine to Australia, it's going to hurt its own industry. So I believe in that way, French are pretty right in to be upset. But yeah, it's good to hear that, okay, they will still continue to be, we'll keep that strategic, alliance all okay, and the focus or the priority in this region to keep the peace maintained in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the question is so the French, I think, are pretty. They view the region broadly and relationships broadly, and although there's a problem, and they're upset about losing the contract, in reality, that I think that they view that their overall interests need to be secured, and the overall interests can't be secured without cooperating with the U.S. and the Australians and others. And I would not be surprised if they find some opportunity to cooperate with the French in the future, but not in terms of the sophisticated technology that's being shared. But I assume that there'll be some quid pro quo moving forward to ensure that the French understand that this was about national interest, not particularly being anti-French.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think Umesh was next, right?
Yes, I think so too. Umesh, hello. Thank you for coming up on stage.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Maya, for hosting this room. And thank you, Ren, for inviting me for such an insightful conversation. Coming to the topic, Japanese role in the Indo-Pacific region. From being a pacifist nation, I think for long, Japan has aspired to take a proactive role in the Indo-Pacific affairs. and we could see in the Olympics as well when they named the when they named when they addressed Taiwan as Taiwan and not as Chinese Taipei. Okay, that was the mark that they are willing to take Chinese heads on. And recently, few days back, they had inked an agreement with Vietnam to provide them with defense equipments as well. They are contemplating actually to raise the defense budget, which is now capped at 1% of the GDP. And not to forget, India and Japan are now involved in the Vladivostok Sea Route in the Arctic as well. And in fact, Japan is now is looking for a greater. It is actually investing in sixth generation fighter aircraft. But if you see other countries are talking about FGFA, they are way ahead in sixth generation fighter aircrafts as well, and all other AI related and Internet of Things technologies, which will define the future warfare. And along with India, Japan is looking to invest in infrastructure projects across Asia as a countermeasure for BRI. And there has been a significant investment in infrastructure projects in India by Japan in the form of a Delhi-Mumbai railway corridor, and also the
That's right.
bullet train which will be running between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And looking forward, Japan would like to take China with the horns, and they are, and if I am not wrong, they have raised like 100,000 forces for defense preparedness in case China would like to invade Taiwan. So it it is and the Chinese foreign minister or the Chinese ambassador has asked Japan to invite Xi Jinping to their country, which Japan has politely declined. So it show and they are trying to even to diversify the supply chain. I have read reports like around 85 to 90 Japanese companies have shifted out of China, and a lot of things are happening. Japan is trying to assert his. It's becoming a true ninja warrior in its fight against uh, and regarding AUKUS, I do feel that that is a apex military alliance, apex alliance, which will supersede Quad and other things. Okay, and all the other formations, whether it will be Quad or even the newly floated CPTPPs, Trans-Pacific, will always align with AUKUS in going forward. AUKUS will shape the Indo-Pacific Indo-Pacific order going forward. And India cannot be part of the AUKUS because 70% of Indians' hardware, military hardware, comes from Russia. And
Russia. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
and India cannot. India should be risking the sanctions of CATSA sanctions in case they go for any higher end US military technology. So that's not possible. But it is a blessing in disguise of this. Because it will provide a necessary security and American focus in the Indo-Pacific by countering Chinese expansion and hegemony. And
Yeah.
not to mention that B3W initiative, which was called by the G7 nations to finance infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. China has invested around 1.5 trillion dollars in 40 countries, and with news of the Chinese reality firm Evergreen on the risk of defaulting, things are not looking better for China. So US has strategically and smartly moved all its bonds when it finds its major adversary what limit actually is limited by choices. Chinese GDP is around, it should be more than 300% of the GDP. So
Yeah.
strategically, the United States have played a very smart role in building the AUKUS. Friends definitely will be very much anger, but uh, going forward, France and India has a very good defense relationship. We have bought the Rafale fighters, so I look forward for a greater defense nuclear submarine partnership going forward as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Umesh. And I think I just want to touch upon a point because I think, although I think Japan has become much more proactive over the past 10 years in terms of its multilateral diplomacy. I think that you may be reading the wrong message to think that Japan is, aching for a conflict with China or that it's going to decouple from China. Japan's economic future is wedded to its relationship with China. And I don't think this equation is going to change. So what we see is a pattern of economic engagement with China, but also being very promiscuous, right? Working with all countries in the region and joining many multilateral partnerships. At the same time, really stressing that it wants to focus on peace and stability in the region, rules-based order within the region, while still Japanese businesses are actively engaging with China. Until that equation changes, which it hasn't, even during the pandemic, and whether it's Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, even the United States, over the past 2 years, trade is up. It's not down, despite the geopolitical tensions going up, and that is probably a bit of a paradox that I think we should be keep our eyes open. So I think, was it Sumit was next or Mark?
It is Mark and then Sumit. Yes.
Okay.
Hello, Sumit. Can you tell?
Mark.
Maya-san, am I allowed?
Yes,
Or is
please.
Mark coming before me?
Of course you are.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Maya-san. Thank you, Stephen-san, for your insights into the subject of Indo-Pacific and the role of Japan. Everybody is more interested on the militarization of Quad, whereas I, as the founder of Indian Economic Forum, which is an economic think tank that we are coming up with, I would like to understand in detail about a few aspects on the commercial and the economic side. As you have been talking
Okay.
about the infrastructure development, and I have, my association with Japanese goes to my association with Indo-Japan Center, wherein we had organized a conference in Japan itself, in Tokyo, on India-Japan Industrial Alliance. And my association with them had been also in supporting and assisting in the back end in the documentation of certain research for SIPA, which was signed in 2013 between India and Japan. So my question is, I see a huge value alignment between India and Japan as vibrant democracies and as open societies. Here I have a few questions.
Yeah.
First and the foremost is, how do you see India, Japan and other democracies coming together in countering BRI with a very substantively positive investment into the development of third world countries, where China has actually gone ahead with a very aggressive BRI plan? Japan is sitting with huge trade surplus, with huge forex reserves, and Japan is one of the largest overseas supporters of India, FDI investors in India, especially in spaces like
Yes.
water treatment, renewable energy, etc. So I want to understand
Yes.
that. Second, second thing is, when we are looking at this alliance, which is a government-to-government thing, which is happening, is there a room for a people-to-people engagement between the Indian industries and the Japanese industries in growing together? Because Japan is one of the leaders when it comes to technology, extremely hardworking labor, but then the labor cost is something which was the reason why you had to come down to China. At the third, and very importantly, India has a very dynamic entrepreneurial system and at the same time cheap labor. Can there be a kind of collaboration between the Japanese technology and the Indian labor and the joint investment in entrepreneurship possible? And what is the way forward for that? Thank you,
All right,
Stephen.
Sumit, I'm
I
going to
look
stop
forward
there.
for your insights.
Thank you for your insight and your cooperation in this discussion, Sumit. I think it's really important that you share your ideas as well. So I think when we're thinking about a concerted effort to provide an alternative to the BRI, Japan has already tried to form a couple different initiatives. And I think the Asian-Africa Growth Corridor and that cooperation with India is one. I think the Infrastructure and Investment Bank between the United States, Australia, and Japan is another. I think that the initiatives that are going to be put forward by the Quad moving forward are all initiatives to compete with the BRI. But what we see, and I wrote about this in a paper, Sino-Japanese relations, through the kind of the reactive diplomacy that we see between FOIT, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, and BRI. What we see is they're moving back and forth, and they're competing back and forth. So Japan and its partners talked about, a gold standard of infrastructure connectivity, focusing on environmental sustainability, fiscal sustainability, lack of geopolitical investments, and no strings attached. And then what we saw at the Second Belt Road Forum in 2019, or 2019-20, by Xi Jinping, is that he adopted a lot of those initiatives. So we're seeing an interaction. So this is good. What it means is that the BRI will probably get better, and any initiatives driven by FOIP vision will probably also get better. So the next question is how can Japan multilateralize some of its infrastructure connectivity initiatives? And as I mentioned in my initial comments, we've already seen that with the Japan-EU Asia infrastructure connectivity projects. But we're also seeing the European Union do this by themselves, as well as country by country. So I think that Japan doesn't necessarily have to work multilaterally on everything. What they need to do is highlight the importance of these initiatives. And I think that the momentum is moving forward. The EU has adopted, again, this infrastructure and connectivity initiative on its own. In a bilateral agreement with Japan, we saw the G7 talk about build the world back better. So we're seeing a lot of different initiatives come online. And the trick to move forward, I think, is that ensuring that those initiatives are not parallel initiatives, but initiatives that complement each other. And I think that's where we can see Japan and others offer some real tangible benefit and be very competitive with the BRI. But that being said, the BRI, in terms of speed and scale and the lack of, it's not very transparent, means that it's more welcome in certain countries. Your second question is about grassroots exchanges. So when I talk to Japanese businesses here that do business in India, I think that they think that there's different views. In the technical field, they find Indians to be really superior. But also there's cultural differences in terms of individuality and argumentiveness that sometimes make it difficult. So I think they're still working out ways to, how can we work with Indian counterparts better? And that's going to take some time. And I think post-COVID, as India's economy slowly comes back online and social stability starts to come online, that we're going to see more FDI being invested in India by Japanese businesses, and ODA, Overseas Direct Investment, invested in India to build that needed infrastructure to create the platforms where Japanese businesses can feel that they can invest safely, sustainably, and long-term. And that is Japan's preference. That's what they did with Southeast Asia. That's what they did with Japan, or China. That's what they did in North America with both Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And my assumption with India is they're going to do something similar.
May I ask a last question before I end?
Sumit, could you please, I'm sorry to interrupt you, could you please keep it just for a while, because we've got Han and she has to leave early. So if please allow us to just let her, pose her question first. Han? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. My name is Hein. So I have a question for Professor Nagy about American economics engagement with Southeast Asia. So what should America do to engage with Southeast Asia economically? Since the option of joining CPTPP is unfeasible domestically, and a smaller agreement on digital economy might be more beneficial for some Southeast Asian states than the others. Thank you.
Thanks, Han. So it's really good to hear from you. So I think that Vice President Harris's initiative when she visited Singapore and Vietnam was quite interesting because I don't know if everybody knows, but she announced the opening of a center of disease control in Hanoi when she was there. And I think that's really an important example of the kind of cooperation that the United States can provide to Southeast Asia. It's apolitical, it's a critical need, and that it's something that is sustainable and it builds goodwill with countries within the region. So I think that when we're thinking about how the United States can engage, is that security is something that is very sensitive for most Southeast Asian countries, as you know. Trade, different countries in Southeast Asia have different views about trade, and that's why we see only 4 countries in Southeast Asia join the TPP. So I think that in some ways, the Japan mini trade deal with the United States could be a model for Southeast Asian countries bilaterally to work with the United States. So just as the United States and Japan signed certain chapters of the TPP in their minilateral trade agreement, that I think that if I was a Southeast Asian country, I would look at the Japanese model, see what areas that they could work out a trade deal with the United States, and perhaps present that as a bilateral selective FTA, whether it's in the digital sphere or other spheres, to, again, build a platform for cooperation moving forward. My view is that in the next maybe, don't be surprised if we see a TPP 2.0 emerge that is led by the United States that will coexist with the first TPP. And it will be a TPP that focuses on the issues that the United States is concerned about, but it will have a lot of the components of the original TPP. So back to my point is that the best way for the United States to engage in with Southeast Asian diplomacy is providing public goods. I think the CDC is a really good example. Second, more diplomatic engagement and supporting some of the developmental initiatives such as the Mekong projects in Southeast Asia. I think that the digital trade agreement may be difficult considering the different political systems in Southeast Asia. But that being said, I think that using the Japan model of mini trade deals may be a way to open the window to creating bilateral relationships and bilateral agreements with some of the Southeast Asian countries. And that's kind of a platform to build other agreements.
Thank you.
Thanks, Han.
Well, thank you, Han. And well, Sumit, I see that you've got another question. Thank you very much for your patience. So please go ahead and yes, proceed with it. And then after that, we can move.
And thank you very much. I don't want to take away more time, but a small question and the last question to Stephen San. I would like to understand from the commercialization of Quad as a kind of trade bloc, what are the limitations and impediments in the formation of the same, and possible ways to resolve those issues? If Stephen San can throw some more light on the deeper issues that could on this.
Okay, thank you, Sumit. So I don't the quadrilateral security trade dialogue as a potential trade bloc at all, and I think that that story ended after India stepped out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and as we know, as India stepped out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the United States stepped out of the TPP. So both of these countries are at this stage in their development are not looking at huge multilateral free trade agreements for different reasons. The U.S. is largely autonomous, and its trade with Japan or other countries is marginal compared to the trade that goes on in North America. In India's case, I think that it's still largely an agrarian society, and I may be wrong, but I think that's my latest understanding, that we still have a huge amount of people that are dependent on the agrarian economy, which makes it difficult to open up the economy in those particular sectors. So I think in the mid to long term, as more ODA and FDI go into India and the economy becomes more diversified and more sophisticated, then India will be a better place to join either RCEP or another trade agreement moving forward. But the Quad, as I mentioned, I think is evolving towards providing public goods to the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that the leader here will be Japan. And the reason why I say Japan, because Japan has the most experience in the region in terms of providing infrastructure, connectivity, development aid, governance good governance. And it's kind of the natural leader in terms of guiding the other countries and in terms of shaping how the Quad provides public goods to the region.
Sumit, I hope this answers your question. So,
Yes, it largely answers my questions. Thank you, Stephen San. Thank you, Maya San.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumit.
Thank you. Well, and Mark, I hope you're still there. Hello, thank you very much for coming up on stage.
Hello, Steve, and hello, Maya. Thanks for hosting the room. So I've been
Hi, Mark.
following the submarine deal. So I have a question, maybe a thought about the AUKUS thing, so that Australia can
Yes.
have the submarine technology. So the question I have is, will this start an submarine race? Because I've read in the news lately that there are officials from Indonesia and Malaysia. They raised concerns that it could start an arms race. And also in terms of the Philippines, because it's the only country that does not have a submarine fleet, but they're looking towards the French to make their deal eventually. And then my thoughts with the submarine deal is that because the French have traditionally been Australia, aside from the submarines, they had they provided the Mirage jets during the Cold War, also with the Tiger gunships, which I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Is by Airbus. But lately they changed to the Apache. So the French are really worried about their investments. But also but the point was raised about they might lose influence in Asia. But I was wondering if they have to change how the French will be in Australia in terms of their their presence to supply the Australian military. So I guess that's all I have in mind. I look forward to your thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really glad that you could jump in. You're calling in from the Philippines, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, ¿cómo está kayo? So, I think that when we're thinking about the Philippines and we're thinking about opening up other markets to, let's say the French in terms of subs, that's always a possibility, but there's a cost issue, right? And these kinds of equipments are very, 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 very expensive. So that leads to your point about we see a submarine race to get submarines. Well, potentially yes, but we have to think about who can afford these super quiet, long-term sustainable nuclear sub. There's very few. Because it's not just about buying it, it's about the sophistication of technology. And I think really importantly is that these subs use what's called highly enriched uranium, right? So I think the big concern for many is does this open the door to some kind of weapons proliferation or the proliferation of nuclear material? And this is something that I think moving forward is that we need to be thinking about. Will other countries say, hey, yeah, we're going to develop nuclear submarines as well, and we're going to be like the Australians, and that we pledge not to use not to develop nuclear weapons, but we're going to have nuclear subs. And that's a slippery slope. And the step from having a nuclear sub to having nuclear weapons is a technical step. And the biggest hurdle to that technical step is actually having the highly processed uranium. So I think that is a real concern in terms of the weapons proliferation community, and that I think that is an area that we're going to have to keep our eyes on moving forward. I still think the French will be very much involved in the region. I don't think their interests have fundamentally changed. As I mentioned, I think that their partnerships with Australia. They had that partnership before the sub deal, and they're going to have that partnership after the sub deal. And I think that, again, the Australians are going to find opportunities for the French to come in and cooperate and deal with their shared interests in the Pacific region, but also in Southeast Asia. Great question, Mark. Thanks.
All right, no problem.
Thank you, Mark. And well, next we've got Takafumi. Hello, Takafumi. I hope I pronounced
Yeah,
your
hi.
name correctly. And
Yes, thank you very much. This is Takafumi from Tokyo, Japan. Thank you very much. Very interesting topic. I think this has been already discussed a lot, but I was thinking that my information right now I'm getting all from today's Financial Times, about AUKUS. But what I find interesting is that I read that what is really the true reason that Australia really changed its procurement from France to this US and also Britain. I read from the FT based on the article in the FT, there seems to be a military decision or military technology, the fact that the US Virginia class and the Britain's Astute class submarines are basically also able to carry Tomahawk missiles, which apparently have a very long range, missiles, right? So I just wanted you guys to comment on that. I mean, that's amazing. I guess a very strategic decision. And then also the fact, what I find interesting is the fact that France did not pull out its ambassador from UK. And what I'm thinking is it's pretty much a 90 billion US dollar deal. And I'm thinking that the French will now try to carve out their portion out of this deal somewhat through Britain. I just want to ask for your comment on that, if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Takafumi. So I think the acquisition of nuclear submarines that have missile capabilities is a strong indication that the three countries view the maritime domain, in particular blue water domain, as an area of particular interest in terms of dominating, and that the acquisition of these technologies ensures that these three countries can work together to dominate the first and second island chain, to potentially constrain China's free flow of movement in and out of the region. I can't tell you how important that is, because I think that China is very much intent on dominating the South China Sea, the first island chain and the second island chain. I'm not criticizing that per se, because I think it strategically makes sense in terms of how China thinks about its security and thinks about its past and thinks about how when it was invaded in the past or when it saw foreign ships from the past, that they always came in from the coast. So, China's strategy is very much about dominating the first and second island chain and breaking down the alliances. So the acquisition of these kinds of technologies really helps these three countries dominate the blue waters and protect those first and second island chains. And I don't think they should be seen in isolation. I think that as we look at the discussions in Tokyo and other countries about A2D2 missile systems placed along the Japanese archipelago. So A2D2 is anti-access, anti-denial. That's the same system that the Chinese are using to, they call them aircraft killers, prevent the American Navy from coming too close to China. So I think that the security moving forward is looking at kind of a layered approach to what kinds of systems that they're using in the region, what's the best way to dominate the maritime domain in terms of maritime domain awareness, but also very, very robust deterrence capabilities. So in my view, I think that's why we've seen this deal happen. The Australians, of course, they have a very strong and enduring partnership with the United States. They're close in terms of intelligence cooperation, but increasingly Australia has turned very hawkish on China, and they have very, I think, pessimistic assertions about Chinese intentions in Southeast Asia, and they feel that it's important to cooperate with the UK and the US on subs. Now, your point about why France didn't withdraw their ambassador from the UK, well, simply the deal was between the US and Australia. It wasn't between the UK. The UK is not providing nuclear technology to the Australians. So I think the French feel they didn't lose anything financially from the UK, but they lost something financially from the Australians and the Americans. And I think it's actually quite as simple as that. I think that the UK would prefer US technology to the French technology. So I'm not sure that the French are going to find a market in the UK.
Well, so thanks. It just says in the FT, it says it is not clear what type of design Canberra will choose. However, it is likely to be based either on the UK's Astute submarines built by BAE Systems or the US Navy's equivalent, the Virginia class, built by General Dynamics Electric Boat and Newport News Shipbuilding. I mean, it's always interesting to see that there's, of course, a huge business interest behind every deal. I mean, political as well as business, right? So I'm kind of interested to figure out, well, okay, how are the French now going to try to carve out the business deal out of this? And I thought the UK route is probably one way to do so. I mean, I just
it guess, sure is. It sure is. But I think when you're thinking about these kinds of deals, are not just about the physical submarines that they're planning on making. This is a very comprehensive development. So you're going to have educational exchanges. You're going to have communities built. Of course, you're going to have shipyards built. There's going to be an investment in education to train all the people. And this will spiral into a whole bunch of other technologies. So it's an injection into the Australian economy that is going to have a whole bunch of positive effects. And I think that's also part of the consideration when the Australians are thinking about why they chose, I think they'll likely choose the American ones, that it's an investment in their economy and technology and their educational institutions. And, as I think the question that I think it was Umesh mentioned, it's an investment in grassroots relations that strengthen the bilateral relation. And for Australia, I think that's really, really critical to ensure that they have the most robust and strong relations with the United States as relations with China become more complicated.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takafumi.
Thank you, Takafumi. Before we proceed, I want to say that it's 9:12. So I'm going to close the hand permissions function in about 2 minutes. So if somebody in the audience reconsiders and wants to come up on stage, please do that within the next 2 minutes. And now we can continue with Vir or Vir. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Are you still there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm there.
Yes, okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, Stephen. Hello, Maya. And greetings to everyone available here in this August room. My fundamental question arises from this contradiction that we are somehow not dealing with, that the shift of focus from Atlantic to Indo-Pacific has come from this shift of center of gravity from USA to China. Somehow it's shifting. It's not a complete change now, but the consumer power has been on parity in the USA and China, and other centers of gravity, technological, military power, and other powers are also quite somehow shifting. So this is creating a kind of power struggle in Indo-Pacific, and that's why this region is in focus. So my question is whether other powers like India, Australia, Japan, France, Britain, and everyone is interested in the same end goal that USA is pursuing, because currently it is the global hegemon and the greatest single superpower. And because I've heard this several times from India's foreign minister and President Macron, that they want multilateral order, and Indian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister has at several forums they have said this, that they are not into this alliance system. They want to maintain their strategic autonomy, and they want multilateral model. So they don't want to create to maintain this unilateralism, that unilateral power that USA exercises. So USA is interested in maintaining its power, and China is interested in displacing it from that position. And what other powers like France and India and Australia are interested in, they want to be in an equilibrium where everyone gets security. So I want to understand from this perspective that how to maintain a security architecture and economic architecture where everyone gets satisfied and they have more incentives to be in the equilibrium than the disincentive to be not in equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. I think that's a really interesting question. So I think that what we often think is in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we called it the unipolar moment or the hyperpower moment. There was a French scholar that talked about hyperpolar movement. And as we moved into the 2000s, the Chinese economy really started to grow quickly. And I think that, up from about 2008 onwards, we moved into kind of a hybrid multipolar world. And what I mean by hybrid multipolar world is that the United States was by and far the dominant military power. Economically, Europe and the United States were about the same. In terms of diplomatic power, the United States was kind of a superpower. But today, 2021, the Chinese economy on purchasing power per person is higher than, is bigger than the American economy. But militarily, the United States still is overwhelmingly, the dominant country. Diplomatically, China has made a huge headways in Africa, some South Asian states, some Southeast Asian states. So now I think the world is still a hybrid multipolar world, but it's flattening. We're seeing more. We're moving into kind of a bipolar world between China and the United States. Now, what does that mean if we move towards a bipolar world where the United States and China are competing? So I think that you got to ask the Chinese scholars themselves and Chinese policymakers themselves. And if you read their work, like Yang Shuitong from Tsinghua University or Peking University's Wang Jixi, they write very explicitly, China will make every effort to prevent the United States from dominating international institutions. They will try to dilute human rights, transparency. They want to focus on a world that prioritizes sovereignty and non-interference and not focusing on universal values such as human rights. So in your question, what does the Australians or the French want? I don't think they want a hyper-powered United States, but I'm positive that they don't want a world in which international institutions don't work according to transparency and rule of law, that human rights no longer are universal, that the concept of democracy is actually competing with authoritarian governments. I think that's pretty clear where they sit. But Western countries and the most developed countries, they don't speak for everybody. I think they speak for most, and I think most countries would like to see that kind of society develop. But for many, and if you go to Africa, they see the Chinese model as an attractive model to build their societies. You go to some Southeast Asian and South Asian states, they see the model as having brought enormous wealth and development to China. So I don't think there's one view. And the question you ended with is, can we create a world where everybody benefits? And here I think the biggest challenge is the Chinese domestic political system requires the outside. It requires a change in the outside system and international institutions to remain intact. And I think that this is a challenge that probably, I don't know what the easy solution is, but it's probably the biggest challenge to international institutions and creating the kind of win-win world that you mentioned, because their system is in many ways incompatible with a system that focuses on transparency and rule of law and the separation of powers. And that's a real challenge moving forward, Veer.
Can I ask a single-liner additional question?
Maya's the boss.
Could you please hold it and see if we have enough time?
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your patience because we've got 3 more people who have questions as well. So, George, hello. Could you please
Yes,
go
hi,
ahead?
thank you. Yes, thank you, Maya and Steve, for holding such a wonderful room. Um, my question is around the issue of Taiwan and what type of role Japan should play in the defense of Taiwan. As you guys know, perhaps know that internally, actually I'm from US, so I can tell you in the last couple of years, we have seen a significant shift of the argument from, in terms of Taiwan defense, arguing, U.S. policy should be, shifting from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, right? It's the volume I can see increasing. So, Steve, if you can, explain to us, what's the kind of internal politics, right, within Japan, how each different, major parties see when it comes to the issue of Taiwan and what type of role Japan should play. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks very much, George. So I think the Japanese government's position is they want the status quo. And if you look at recent documents, whether it's the U.S.-Japan, summit between Suga and Biden, they talked about peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. If you look at the G7 summit, you look at other statements, Japan continues to say we want the status quo. So we've seen some contradictions to that. So the Defense Minister Kishinobu and Vice Minister Aso Taro and others have said that, Taiwan's a family member and that we might have to come to defend it because it's in our inherent national security. So I think, again, that's a message to the Chinese. Please don't be aggressive because, Japan doesn't want to get involved, and Japan sees this as, part of its national security because, the sea lanes of communication go up through Taiwan, and of course the semiconductor issue I mentioned is really important. So Japan is sending the signal to China that it wants the status quo. It doesn't want China to push reunification by force. And it's sending the same signal to the Taiwanese. And just last week we had party-to-party, the LDP and their equivalent in Taiwan had defense talks. And the same message is that they don't want to embolden the Taiwanese to call for independence because it will end badly, right? If the Taiwanese call for independence or the one China policy ends, this will back Xi Jinping into a corner where he's going to have to do something militarily to keep his head. So I don't think Japan wants this. They want the status quo. They want peace and stability in the region. Arguably, the United States wants the same. And I think if you look at, there's an essay in Foreign Policy by Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken that was out in 2019, and they talk about Taiwan as actually being a success in terms of bilateral relations between China and the United States, and that they were able to find a fuzzy area where they could continue the relations, and Taiwan wasn't such a focal point. So I'm concerned that Taiwan could spiral into a conflict, and the conflict wouldn't just stay in the region, and it would have dramatic economic consequences for all the countries within the region. And I think that it could be very, very serious. I think Japan understands that. Within the LDP, I think that's the broad understanding. Within the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, I think that's the understanding. I think within the Japanese Communist Party of Japan, I don't think they have a realistic policy at all. With the other kind of minority parties, I don't think that they differ so much from the LDP in terms of the position that I just gave you. They want the status quo. They don't want to embolden Xi Jinping and the nationalists in China, and they don't want to embolden the pro-independent groups in Taiwan. It's a very narrow needle to thread, and it's becoming increasingly difficult.
George, I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for the great question.
And well, so let's move on, and we've got AP Samba. Good evening or good morning to you, depending on where you are.
Hello. It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for the great room. And how's the relation between with Australia and Japan? After the AUKUS agreement or with submarine, how is the relation with Australia and Japan? I will make sure.
Thanks, AP. I love your dog, by the way. It's really cute.
Thank you.
So I think the Australian-Japanese relationship remains rock solid at the grassroots level, at the business level, and in terms of security. Japan is going to sign a defense treaty with reciprocal basing rights with the Australians probably this year. They're having a meeting in Washington this week with the Quad, and that relationship continues to deepen broadly. And Japan sees Australia as really a critical partner in its defense and in helping the Indo-Pacific region develop along the so-called rules-based in a rules-based way. And I think that I can't tell you how strong the relationship is. It's very, very robust. And Scott Morrison's visit last year in October to sign this commitment to a defense treaty was really, really significant in that, he had to go back. He came here for one day and he had to go back and do quarantine in Australia for 2 weeks. That was the commitment of the Australians, and I think the Japanese recognized that.
Stephen, are you okay? Stephen?
Yep, go ahead.
All right.
I know Hayato's on the call, but I saw
Also, we've got,
Sadia raise her hand a couple times.
Yes, so
I don't want to
Yeah, hi.
say no to.
No, thank you so much. Konnichiwa. 本当に面白いです。I just wanted to commend because I've stayed about a decade in Japan, and it's so lovely to see so many people discussing the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. So I'm going to be a learner, basically. It's just a comment to appreciate for creating this room so that we can have a better understanding. And all the Japanese people here love Japan, and konnichiwa again, and would love to see you again. Love the Japanese food. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for letting me talk. Whenever I have a question, I'll definitely come again and talk to you. Thank you so much. Arigato.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sadia.
Thank you, Sadia.
Well, and we can then, move on. Hayato?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So 2 questions, right? One is recently the Taiwanese has raised their defense budget from $15 billion to an additional to $18 billion next coming year, plus the $9 billion in the additional missile program, right? So it's now $27 billion. Japan is about $60 billion in which is like around 1% GDP. But do you think that Japan is going to kind of keep the pace and increase the defense budget to try to match, the rest of the world, at least for the Taiwanese, because if the Taiwan is being conquered, now Japan will be the next. So that's one question. Second is, my understanding is this, Aussie, cancel the French, submarine program because they are so incompetent, right? Because they are supposed to have delivered 4 submarines out of 12 by now, but now they are talking about start delivering in 2040 or maybe 50, right? And as you know, 20 or 30 years later, is not going to cut it, right? Yeah, because now the threat is now, So for that, to me, if you're so incompetent cannot do anything for next 20, 30 years, the French deserve to get fired. But what do you think about that? Right. So that's my second question.
Thanks, Hayato. So on the first question, I think it's really interesting to see that the Taiwanese have actually boosted their budget. The question is that I guess the real concerns in the security community is what is the willingness of the Taiwanese to defend themselves? And that means in terms of the kinds of acquisitions that they make, the kinds of defense systems they're going to make and they're going to build, and their commitment to defending themselves. And this is a real big open question. And the second open question about Taiwan is how sustainable is this continued spending? And I think that there's great concerns about that. And the simple reason is if the Taiwanese aren't going to defend themselves, why should the Japanese or others, right? Now, on the Japanese side, will they increase their defense budget? They continue to increase their defense budget by 1 or 2% every year, which is not much. And I think it's made a lot of press over the past 10 years because we've seen an increase in the budget 1 or 2% every year. But I think that you should put that in the context of Abenomics and quantitative easing and the fact that the yen has been devalued, which means they actually have to spend more to buy the same amount. So if you do the adjustment, Japan is really flat on spending, and flat or just a little bit above, and it's not spending enough to deal with its security challenges within the region. And Timothy Langley's and Maya's room on Sundays, they talk a lot about this, not so much into the details of the politics, but the candidates this time around have talked about acquiring different weapon systems. So Kishida's talking about preemptive strike capabilities, Kono is talking about others, Takaichi is talking about raising the spending up to 2% of the national budget. This makes sense. Most countries in the region are spending at least 2% of the GDP on defense. And when they're talking about increases in defense spending, last year I think the Koreans were 5% and the Chinese were 8.25%. So Japan's definitely not keeping up with their peers. And that raises questions about, what's going to happen with Japan's defense in the years to come. So the question is, can Japan achieve its security without an enormous increase in defense spending? And I think that rather than defense spending, I think that some changes in how they use their funds, which technologies they invest in. So I think they need to invest in cyber and maritime, not so much Air Force, probably some more satellite technology so they understand the situations, maybe missile defense, automation, and all of this presents opportunities to reduce cost over the long term. And of course they have partnerships in their alliance with the United States as well, which helps with their security. So there's a lot to be thinking about how Japan can help itself. But I do think there's probably some legal changes that could also help the Japanese train themselves so that they're more efficient in terms of dealing with their defense. And of course, this has to do with changing the constitution, which is very, very, very difficult in the Japanese context.
Yeah, and also they had to get the real serious training. Otherwise, they got to run away like Afghan. No use for defense budget.
Well, I think the common refrain is that they have the greatest technology, but they're not using it in the way that they should have it. It's like buying a Lamborghini in Tokyo. Like, when are you going to drive the Lamborghini the way you should drive a Lamborghini in Tokyo? And Japan has the best technologies, but the way the constitution works and the way the self-defense forces are trained is that they're not using the technologies in the way they should.
Yeah, I agree.
Maya, can I just a quick response to what Stephen just said? Just a quick one.
Yes, if Stephen is okay, because Stephen, are you okay with another 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, a couple more minutes is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Just,
no problem.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, as always. Based on the defense spending number you just mentioned, it appears that that we need to worry about whether Japan is more committed than the Taiwanese, because Taiwanese is obviously committed because they're spending so much money. So if there's a country we have to worry about whether we should come to help you from the US, that is Japan. We are not sure they are really committed to do this. So that's one point. So what signals has the defense or the security community has picked up that worry the community that Taiwan may not be as committed as they should be? Again, with the point that I think Japan, we should worry about Japan more than Taiwan, to be honest. But with that, that was my quick question. Thank you, Maya.
Oh, you're welcome.
So on Taiwan, I think some of the concerns that they used to have national conscription, but now they don't. So the number of troops are rapidly shrinking. So you actually need troops to fight, right? Which is a challenge. And I think some of the recent acquisitions of the Taiwanese, they bought some very 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 heavy tanks, which aren't really productive in terms of defending the Taiwanese. So I think some of their acquisitions, the fact that conscription is finished and we see a drop in the number of people joining the military in Taiwan, all suggests that to observers that Taiwan is, of course, committed to its defense, but maybe not as committed as others would like to see. So that is a real question for many countries: is will they defend themselves? And it's a lot more complicated than you think, right? Nobody wants to die, and nobody wants their families to be ruined. And Taiwan is literally under 100 kilometers away from the mainland, and it's not unimaginable that it could happen very very quickly, and the situation could fundamentally change. And for the Taiwanese, this is a constant worry. I think the advice that many countries are giving the Taiwanese is to create what they call a porcupine strategy. So basically make it really, really, really painful for the Chinese if they try to force reunification. And that doesn't mean, expensive jets and heavy tanks. It could be other kinds of defense systems that slow down the process of a forced military unification. Mining the seas and drones and other forms of technology. So I think that they're moving in the right direction. The real question is will it be enough? And I think what will drive this one direction or the other is behavior from China and a sense of support from the United States in particular, but also Australia and Japan. And of those three, I think the United States is probably the most reliable. Australia, there's debates, and in the UK as well, whether it's in the interest of those countries to come to Taiwan's defense. It's very complicated, and as all our countries are moving to become more inward-looking, that more and more countries are thinking about what is the cost of these kinds of support for our neighbors. And yeah, it's a really tough situation.
Thank you.
Maya, may I ask one question?
Oh, well, Stephen, how do you feel about this?
Let's make this the last
Maya.
one, okay,
that's
Maya?
okay. Yes, Stephen? Sorry.
Let's make this the last
Right.
question, all right,
Okay.
Maya?
Yes, this will be the last one then. Umesh, please go ahead.
Stephen, you mentioned about good governance in Japan. I admit it. And just to throw a light on the perspective, in 2018, Xi Jinping made him the president of life. Okay. But on the contrary, in Japan, when Shinzo Abe found that he has a disease, he voluntarily stepped down. And right now we find Yoshihide, I don't remember the first name. Sugaji also is voluntarily stepping down due to unfavorable public opinion in handling the COVID situation. So the virtues are very much different. My question is, will the frequent changes in leadership affect the Japanese resolve like to counter China?
Thank you very much, Umesh. So as I mentioned, I think that the idea of countering China is maybe the wrong expression in terms of how Japan and the political parties are thinking about how they're managing China. Japan's biggest trading partner is China by far. The Keidanren, the Japanese Business Federation, wants to continue to have strong economic relations with China. Japan's economic prosperity moving forward in a sustainable manner is going to be based on its relationship with China. So you can't have an overly aggressive position, but you need to state your bottom line and your red lines very, very explicitly. So I think that the current leadership and the current, I think the dominant party, all understand this to varying degrees. And the question is, where do they find? Do they push a little bit harder, or do they become a little bit softer? And if you look at the engagement of Japan-China relations over the past 40 years, it's a cycle of squeezing and relaxing, squeezing and relaxing. We saw early 80s as being the golden era of Sino-Japanese relations. In the mid-80s, with Nakasone visiting Yasukuni Shrine, we saw Deng Xiaoping react by squeezing. And then they relaxed again, and they squeezed again. And the last squeeze was really after the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands until about 2017 and 18, and then we had to relax as they were preparing for the fifth political document and Xi Jinping potentially coming to China or to Japan. But that's not going to happen now. And right now we're in a kind of a strange place where the Chinese are not squeezing the Japanese, and the Japanese are not squeezing the Chinese too much. But I don't think that's sustainable. I think eventually China will start to put pressure back on Japan as Japan takes a more a somewhat stronger stance on different aspects of the relationship with China. But I want to emphasize that the relationship is very comprehensive. The economic interests are very comprehensive. And on the China side, they don't want to cut off Japan either. And if you go to local governments in China, you talk to local communities in China, local provinces, they all value Japanese investment, Japanese businesses, Japanese manufacturing, and the relationships with Japan very, very, very much. And their view about bilateral relations is different than the central government.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.